Hello, friends. Lee C. Camp here. You're listening to No Small Endeavor. This is our unabridged interview with Professor Matt Lee. Matt has appointments both at Harvard and Baylor University. We got to sit down in person with Matt out at Baylor. We were generously invited to come out to Baylor for a conference on AI and being human, hosted by the Institute for Faith and Learning there at Baylor. Grateful for the invitation of Professors Elizabeth Kincaid and Professor John Barton, and for the lovely time we had there in Baylor, getting to sit down with a lot of remarkable folks. And you'll be hearing a variety of outputs from those interviews here in the next number of weeks on No Small Endeavor. This conversation with Matt was really moving and really quite beautiful. Matt started out as doing kind of work in criminology, studying murder and looking at the sort of social dynamics in communities around murder, and then found that, as he says in the interview, that looking into that abyss, the abyss stares back into oneself, and that it was not a healthy or a helpful way to spend his days and spend his vocation. And so he began asking other questions, more fruitful questions, questions about human flourishing, questions about what it might mean to think of love as a social practice, a sociology of love even, if you will. And so we discussed a lot of remarkable ways to think about that question in this interview. I especially took away from him this insistence that we must not think of flourishing through a potted plant metaphor. This sticks out to me because I think a lot of times, naturally people can ask, well, what do we mean by flourishing? And I always think, well, think about a potted plant, right? That you can tell looking at your potted plants, whether it's flourishing, which is related to the word flower, right? You can tell whether it's flourishing or not by looking at it, paying attention to it. Is it flowering? Is it growing? Is it doing well? But Matt here suggests that if we reduce it to a potted plant metaphor, we're missing so much, that instead we should think in terms of the vision of a forest, that underneath the ground of the forest, all of the plants will flourish or not together, that they're sharing resources, that they're sharing life, that they're sharing that beautiful space there together. And that this gives us a different kind of vision of what it might mean for us to flourish, that we cannot do it alone, that we will only do it with all of those around us. Here's Professor Matthew T. Lee. Enjoy. Hello, friends. Lee C. Camp here. If you enjoy the kinds of conversations we have here on No Small Endeavor about ideas, culture, and how we might make sense of the world, there's another show you might appreciate. It's called The Gist with Mike Pesca. The Gist is the longest-running daily news podcast, and each weekday, Mike takes about 30 minutes to examine the stories shaping our moment. What makes the show interesting is that it resists the usual partisan scripts. Mike brings on economists, historians, journalists, and other thinkers to look at issues from multiple angles. One day, he might unpack the dynamics of a major political story. Another day, he might explore the psychology behind public outrage, or why we humans are so quick to believe strange things. Mike's an award-winning journalist whose work has appeared in outlets like The Atlantic, The Free Press, and The Washington Post. His approach combines careful reporting with a sharp sense of humor and a willingness to question assumptions wherever they come from. If you're someone who likes thoughtful inquiry and conversations that challenge easy answers, give The Gist a listen. You can find The Gist every weekday on YouTube or follow wherever you get your podcasts.
Are you curious about the hidden side of everything? Then I have a podcast for you. I'm Stephen Dubner, host of Freakonomics Radio. Each week, we hear from some of the most fascinating scholars and thinkers as we tackle big topics like how whales became the face of environmental activism, how to succeed at failing, and whether public transportation should be free. Go ahead, listen to Freakonomics Radio wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey friends, Lee Camp here. We all need advice, but it's not always clear who to ask, even in 2026, which is why I recommend checking out How To, the long-standing advice show and 2026 AMBI Award-nominated Best Personal Growth Podcast. No Small Endeavor was also just up for the very same award in that category, so you know How To must be a great companion to our show. More than that, How To is back with new episodes and a new host with award-winning journalist Mike Pesca. Each week, Mike tackles a listener question ranging from travel to finance to relationships and beyond, with help from world-class experts who actually know what they are talking about. Think of it as eavesdropping on someone else's therapy session without a copay or awkward silence. No questions too big or too specific, like how to protect the elderly from scammers, or how to give to a good cause and make it count, and even how to make a how-to podcast. You've got questions, they will find some answers. So follow How To with Mike Pesca on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Matthew T. Lee is professor of the Social Sciences and Humanities and associate director of the Institute for Global Human Flourishing at Baylor University. He's also director of the Flourishing Network at the Human Flourishing Program in the Institute for Quantitative Social Science at Harvard University. Welcome, Dr. Lee.
So glad to be with you, and thank you for all the dialogues that you've been hosting on such important topics.
Thank you very much. Grateful to get to be with you here. And I'm here in Baylor, a guest of the Institute for Faith and Learning, and grateful to get to meet with a lot of folks here in Waco. So glad to get to connect with you. I want to begin with a kind of literally a sophomoric question. For those who hear the word sociology and they're not so sure what a sociologist does, what's a sociologist do?
Well, there's a lot of variation among sociologists and how they would answer that question. My PhD is in sociology, but my bachelor's degree is in psychology. My master's is in criminology. And I spent the first half of my career, I would say, focused primarily on murder. And so a sociological approach to a topic like that would consider how group differences are important. So in other words, how do we understand not just the individual decision to kill, but the context in which that decision is made? And so we're not unconcerned with the individual, but it's really the intersection between the individual's agency and the community constraints or encouragements to do acts like murder.
So it's that you cannot sufficiently understand any given individual or individual's choices apart from examining the social dynamics, social institutions, social commitments around that individual?
Yes, that is really important. And then how that plays out will depend on the sociologist. So I have since come to see myself as someone who does more interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, even transdisciplinary work. So I'm not limited by sociology, but grateful for the grounding that I had in that discipline, where I would understand not just what's important to Matt as an individual, but how am I operating according to a kind of institutional logic or set of logics.
Yeah. Which may be opaque, I guess, unless someone surfaces them and says, okay, we've got these kind of commitments. And then all of a sudden you begin to say, oh, well, maybe that's the reason I, as an individual, am reacting or responding in a given way.
Right. So we all have worldviews, and our worldviews are shaped by a great many influences. Of course, the family, our local community, our nation, and then whether we're sort of in Western civilization broadly defined or something else, that's all going to be part of it. And that really shapes how we understand reality and relate to reality.
So what about methodology? I mean, what kind of methodology or methodologies get employed in trying to get at these kind of questions?
Well, on the one hand, you can certainly do a lot with statistics and group differences that you can measure with central tendency, means and averages, those kinds of things. And, you can begin to understand and control for other possibly related factors and find out which of those factors are most significant from a statistical standpoint in shaping how groups and individuals will behave. And so the quantitative part, and so I'm part of the Institute for Quantitative Social Science at Harvard, is really important. But there's a qualitative side as well, where you're trying to understand not for the purpose of predicting so you can control or change or intervene, but understanding the lived experience of individuals and groups for their own sake on their own terms. So you want to understand what is meaningful, even if that involves some things from an outsider's perspective that might not be strictly speaking true. But beliefs are powerful regardless of whether they correspond to empirical reality. So those are two very different ways to come at it, and I appreciate both.
Yeah. So you said that early in your career, you spent much of your time looking at murder.
Yeah.
So what were some of the kind of questions that you're asking in this regard in looking at that topic?
So one of the key questions that we had at the time was, is it true that immigration as a social process or immigrants as groups of people increase crime? When you see immigration happening, when you see immigrants moving in, does crime go up? And there was, without going into a long lecture, but just very briefly, there was a pretty dominant perspective within criminology called the social disorganization perspective. And that would suggest that as neighborhoods are disrupted by any kind of turnover, it could be immigrants from outside the United States or other kinds of migration processes, internal processes, that's going to weaken the community's ability to engage in social control, and then crime will go up. And we saw some anomalies with regard to immigration, where immigration as a social process and immigrants as a group of people were both, in both cases, not having that effect. And so, and in some cases, we would see lower crime rates. And so eventually we coined the term immigration revitalization perspective to offer an alternative explanation to the social disorganization perspective. So what we saw is, and other demographers who don't focus on crime have seen this with regard to economic outcomes or health outcomes, that you might expect some bad outcomes, but paradoxically you get some really good outcomes. So what's going on there? Strong sense of community, strong purpose for moving to the country. It's not coming here to create problems or cause crime, but to build a better life. And so strong family ties, strong religious ties, strong ties to the labor market. So when you start to look at it, it is possible that sometimes these processes create disorganization and sometimes they create revitalization. And so one of the things that we did is to study that empirically in a number of cities. And we found very little evidence that the social disorganization perspective could explain adequately the patterns that we were seeing within neighborhoods. So we were looking at census tracts as a proxy for neighborhoods.
I mean, one of the kind of obvious follow-up questions that comes to my mind is, what then would the sociologists have to say about the rise of xenophobia and that seems to be driving the narrative that your research said seems not to be the case? Yeah,
it's driven not by the broader empirical patterns, but a handful of horror stories that are often not representative of the broader patterns. So there are other reasons why you would create a set of beliefs around a powerful set of stories that are told over and over again that are essentially exercises in manipulating mass audiences. To not put too fine a point on it. For political gain, if you want me to add that.
I mean, what's that like for you as an academic, seeing that kind of dynamic occur when you have empirical evidence, you have numbers saying, no, that's not true? What's that been like for you?
Yeah, I mean, professionally, it's frustrating. Personally, I have felt this about a number of topics over my career, that we seem collectively not to be at a developmental level where we are collectively able to embrace and hold aspects of reality. We collectively seem to create beliefs that are grounded in ideologies rather than empirical realities. And that's, I have struggled with that fact, but I'm increasingly, as I get older, trying to accept it. So I do my work. I try to tell what I'm able to with appropriate intellectual humility about the limits of our methodologies. But then I say, well, on the other side, what is the evidence? And there's anecdotal evidence and other kinds of things, but it doesn't really help us understand what's actually occurring in the lives of most people. And so that's frustrating, but I'm I'm making peace with that so I can have more equanimity.
So, I mean, going back, just to kind of keep pushing a little bit more. So how do you narrate that fact of our apparent inability as a society to hold empirical claims that may be contrary to fear-mongering, say? How do you account for that sociologically?
Oh, it's very easy. There are vested interests behind that. So there's a lot of money to be made or political power to be seized by framing things in ways that create fear. Fear enables leaders to manipulate masses. And that's, I think that we have been overall conditioned now to believe that there's sort of bad intentions within every group. So I can believe the group that I am ideologically aligned with and discount the others because everybody's making things up or manipulating or whatever. And I think that's very dangerous, especially as we get into AI generating very realistic looking images of people doing things that they didn't do. And so how do we recover that sense of goodwill that would enable us to care enough about empirical reality to really want to understand it? And I've had people say to me, well, you can say anything you want with statistics. Yes, that's probably true, but I don't have to do that. I can do something else. I can be surprised when I learn something that I'm not expecting, or I can be committed to methodological rigor. And this is why in the Global Flourishing study, we are pre-registering all of our analytical plans and sharing all of the analytical code. And the data is all freely available through the Center for Open Science, so that if we've made a mistake or we've engaged in something that that someone else would have done differently, they can do it. And then in the peer review process and in the scientific marketplace of ideas, we can begin to sort out what's real and what's not real. So that's a bit of a lecture. I'm sorry for that.
No, thank you. So, I mean, you spend a number of years studying criminology, murder, these sorts of questions, and then you seem to take something significant sort of pivot, I guess, from that to maybe sociology of love or sociology of human flourishing. How did that pivot occur?
Well, we've only got an hour, so I'll be brief. I think it was Nietzsche who said, when you stare into the abyss stares into you. So it was not good for me to be focused on why are people doing bad things. And in the process, having to read very graphic accounts of homicide cases where we're coding certain variables, but we need, you have to read the original. So it just felt like I didn't like who I was becoming kind of developmentally in my life. And I saw opportunities for something else. When I started as a professor in the fall of 2000, I was given a course on the sociology of law to teach. And I didn't feel particularly strong in that topic, but I was one of the few criminologists, so somebody had to teach it. It's a required course. And so I had some freedom with the syllabus to put some things in there that I thought, well, maybe it's not by the book, but let's try it. And so I put in one day a topic which I titled, using the Tina Turner song as a reference point, Law, What's Love Got to Do with It? And we did some restorative justice kind of things, and it wasn't the adversarial winner-take-all kind of approach. And the students liked it and I liked it. So I thought, well, maybe do a week on that next time. So we did, and then it was 2 weeks. And by the time I was granted tenure and could have some more autonomy in what I was teaching, it was a large part of the course. And I just said, why don't we just rename it Sociology of Love? And then from there, we did that for a while. But it's fun to read and talk, but what if we actually practiced it? So we kind of flipped the classroom and called it Love in Action, and most of it was out in the world, trying to experiment with random acts of kindness for strangers versus relatives. And what do you learn from that? Oh, what we learn is that the relatives are very suspicious. What do you want from me? There's got to be an ulterior motive. Oh, is that how you really see me? As someone who's just going to manipulate. And then the strangers are just happy to receive. So, so the students would come back, and there was a lot of wisdom. And so that shifted me, I think, in ways that I wasn't fully aware of at the time, but looking back, I now see it, from education as a monologue, where I have the content, and as a student, you receive it, and then there's a certain level of fidelity with regard to how you can give that back to me. And if it's high, I'll give you an A. And if it's not, then you get something less than that. And so shifting from monologue to dialogue, where I really felt like I was learning more from the students than perhaps they were getting from me, but they were learning from each other as well. So we created a container in which you could have these experiments and relate it back to sociology, but really that class could have worked in other departments as well. So I started to stray from my discipline. Then I got involved in some interdisciplinary work, and that's why I like to have this title, Professor of the Social Sciences and Humanities, instead of Professor of Sociology, because I've come to see dialogue as really important to the education of students and the education of faculty, but also the mutual enrichment of disciplines.
So begin to unpack that for us, of why social science and humanities has been important to you.
Well, we have a lot of research now on human flourishing, and a topic like human flourishing cannot be reduced to numbers that you can crunch with computers. Of course, there's a vantage point on flourishing there, but you need theology and philosophy and history and the other humanities disciplines. You even need the creative arts. A good novel can tell us a lot about flourishing, a lot of depth there. A good history of the beloved communities within the civil rights movement can tell us something that, okay, so we're answering questions on a survey about our own subjective experience, but what was it like to really invite the opponent to flourish with you while the opponent is putting you in jail, et cetera. So I think that it invites a kind of generous sharing where we can become curious about something that I wasn't trained in. I was reading a lot of philosophy and theology and related topics, but I never had any formal training in that. So I needed colleagues who had a PhD in one of those disciplines to help me understand. I knew just enough to be dangerous, as they say. And so we are able to understand something like flourishing, which has so many different definitions and ways of framing it, from a dialogue, from within a vantage point of dialogue across disciplines, and even with colleagues who are not in academic disciplines, but are already doing something incredible in the business world, for example, or in the nonprofit sector, or in government. So we start to take this approach to dialogue that is inclusive of other sectors beyond the academy.
I mean, that reminds me, reading years ago, an essay by Peter Drucker, the famous management guru. And as I recollect, he was bemoaning the way in which the discipline of management had failed its practitioners. And he said quite pointedly that one of the reasons business schools had failed those who studied management was because they refused to ask the question, why? Why manage more efficiently? And that it was precisely because they had failed to take seriously the humanities that they had lost sight of that kind of question, because it's literature, as you were just saying, it's literature, it's philosophy, it's theology, history that's always asking the question of why and toward what end and for what purpose.
Yeah.
And that when you refuse to ask that question, then you can just do whatever it is that you're doing more efficiently that may be useless or may be purposeless or maybe even destructive.
Yes.
So, but I hear you saying a very similar sort of thing.
Yes. Well, now I like that we've shifted into true dialogue because you're not interrogating me and picking my brain, but you've shared something that's really central to what I've experienced with a lot of groups across sectors, but certainly in the business community. There's a CEO named Bob Chapman who's co-authored a book called Everybody Matters. And he says what we're suffering from is leadership malpractice. So you can manage for scarcity, but you have to lead for abundance. Now I'm riffing a little bit. This is not him anymore, but managing for scarcity or managing for efficiency. But again, why? And so if we care about the whole person and not just the person as productive robot, because AI will come and replace us, or robots actually have already replaced many people in jobs. I was told that there's some factory now where there's no lights because the robots don't have eyes. They just work in the dark.
Wow.
And I thought, if I'm the only human being like sweeping the floors or something in that place, that's pretty frightening. But, we can begin to ask a broader question, what is the North Star here? If it's just the extraction of labor and resources for profit, then it's hard to get too inspired by that. And in fact, Gallup has done surveys around the world where they routinely find maybe 2 out of 10 workers are engaged in the sense that they're passionate about what they're doing, they know that they're cared about, and that they can use their strengths. So it's very unusual, I guess, for our species right now, for us to be genuinely fulfilled by our work. But in some of our research, we find that there's really 4 broad meanings of work. One is a job. It's a useful good. It's an extrinsic motivation. I'm doing it because I get a paycheck. Well, in our work, that doesn't lead to flourishing, not surprisingly. But even career is not associated empirically with flourishing. So career, you've got the extrinsic motivation, but also the intrinsic motivation. You're trying to become better in your field, or you have not just a useful good, but a pleasant good. The self-esteem that comes from being a better sociologist or something like that. But that's ultimately not fulfilling. And so there are 2 other meanings that work can have. One is a moral calling and the other is a sacred calling. And those are the 2 that we find empirically associated with flourishing. So if we are creating a world, if I'm managing an organization, I'm not using the word leader here, but if I'm just managing for scarcity and I'm leading an organization that's enormously profitable, and we give back 1% of our profit to support local communities, and it's millions of dollars. And we make a product that people like to use. But 8 out of 10 are not engaged and not flourishing, and maybe 20% are actively miserable and trying to sabotage what we're doing. It's hard to call that a success, but we've called that a success for a long time. And we've created a world where human beings are finding need substitutes because the basic needs are going unmet. And the question is that happening everywhere? Well, yeah, but it's not all the time. There are groups, and we could refer to these as ecosystems of sacred hospitality. Even within any economic, political system, any kind of organization, you'll always find a group that really seems to care about each other, that has figured out how to use their gifts and their deep strengths, and they're contributing to a purpose that they believe in. You can find that everywhere. And so that's the good news. The bad news is it's pretty rare. So we've got work to do, but it is this question of why. Why are we doing this? And so from the work that we're doing now, we're trying to say, what is the deeper purpose? And then how does that help to shape the relational field that we've created in terms of how we interact? So if we have a shallow purpose, then we're going to have fairly instrumental relationships. If we have a deep purpose, then we're going to have loving relationships. And then what we're manifesting, the outputs there, are going to be more aligned with creating a world in which all people can flourish. And so you have different kinds of organizations that are leaning into that, taking the high road, as Rebecca Henderson says. And then there's a lot that are taking the low road. And the low road is really a social disaster.
I want to dig into a lot of what you've just said there, but before we do, let me ask a question about from your discipline again. Here you are suggesting that you want to be not just a sociologist, but a sociologist who's bringing together the social sciences and the humanities and all of these larger kinds of questions. Have you gotten much pushback from your guild in that regard, or are people saying, "Yeah, you're onto something," or both?
I think both. I think in any university there are certain criteria that you have to exceed in order to be granted tenure, in order to be promoted to the next level of professor, in order to stay within that department which has a particular name. And some of those can be quite narrow. Some departments have very narrow criteria. Others are a little bit broad. I was fortunate that I could get away with a lot. My department was open to exploration. And it helped that we had a $2 million grant from the Templeton Foundation. Yeah. So you get a big grant and all things are forgiven. But, it was there was a lot of pushback. We had a book called The Heart of Religion, which was based on that work. And the subtitle was something like God's Love, Spiritual Empowerment, and Benevolent Service, or something like that. And we were meeting with the PR team at the university, and we said, maybe you can promote this on the university's website. Oh, no, we don't promote books on the university's website. And we pulled up our computer, and there's a book being promoted on the university's website. That's an example of the kind of interesting responses that we would get when there was some, concern about how this topic related to a state university, a public university. So I would say that there was a lot of that, but I would also say that I have seen the joy that happens when people who have been working in their discipline and loving what they do all of a sudden join a dialogue where this topic is approached from a different vantage point with a different set of skills. And then they become genuinely curious about, that was my blind spot. I wasn't even thinking about that. Now I can see a little bit more than before, and I'm not trying to defend turf. Now, I will say in higher education, there are a lot of turf battles, and that's where some of the pushback comes from. If we're so generous, maybe they'll get rid of our department. Or if we don't fit into the narrow STEM, science, technology, and medicine, engineering, if we don't fit into that very clearly, then we're not useful. We may be asking this why question, but we're not doing enough of the productivity in a narrow kind of efficiency sense.
So let's talk now then about, as you've asked these larger questions or interdisciplinary kinds of questions, help us think about maybe some of the arguments or what you would now say are insufficient definitions of human flourishing and the sort of broader or fuller maybe definitions of flourishing that you're beginning to work with.
Well, how would you describe a sufficient definition? I'd be curious. You've given a lot of thought to this, and I'll work with that.
Yeah. Well,
what would it encompass, I guess?
Yeah. For me, it's going to encompass, let me begin by saying, the way I often will talk about a good life goes back to a line from Alistair McIntyre's book, After Virtue, in which he says that a good life is a life spent seeking a good life and then pursues the virtues necessary to make such a life possible.
Right.
And so that's pretty vague and large, but it has a certain specificity to it that I find immensely helpful.
Yes.
Because it's holistic.
Yes. Okay, that's it.
Yeah.
Now, what I would say is that, again, in the humanities, more of a sense of that. In the social sciences, sometimes we want something that's very narrow so that it doesn't overlap with other constructs. So there's good reasons for it. But then you start to study something like happiness and reduce it to positive affect.
Yeah.
Well, where's the virtue? Where's the holistic sense of the person? So in a lot of especially quantitative work, there is this tendency to approach the topic analytically, which means to carve it up in ways that don't reflect the holism. And so one of the things that we have noticed as we've done these kinds of dialogues, and I've asked that question, is that people sort of gravitate towards, let's make sure it's good. Let's make sure there's some virtue there, and let's make sure that it is encompassing somehow. So what does it need to encompass? For a lot of research on wellness or well-being, wellness, happiness, some of these constructs that have a very narrow definition, it's usually my subjective experience of how I feel life is going. So am I satisfied with my life? Am I happy about my life? Is my life meaningful? Well, I could say yes to all of those at a very high level and be doing just atrocious things in the world. So we wouldn't want to say that that's flourishing, because flourishing is not just about the individual's subjective experience, which is important. We don't cut that out. But it's also about how are you contributing to creating the conditions for flourishing for others. So the metaphor is not the isolated flower in the pot, as beautiful as that might be, but the forest, where under the ground the roots are sharing resources, where there's the conditions for that our sense of flourishing is enhanced when we see that we're flourishing with others and creating the conditions for others to flourish. So it's this beautiful kind of forest metaphor that invites us to pay attention to the individual, but not just a biological slab as allopathic medicine has often treated human beings, but the whole person. And the whole person is going to include the emotions. It's going to include a sense of spirituality, a sense of higher purpose. And so we start to see the whole person within a beloved community. That's the framing that I like, where we are not just inviting our friends and family to flourish with us, but even the opponent, even the one who's working against our flourishing. There's an invitation there. And then that beloved community is connected to other communities. And we can start to see an ecosystem emerging. And that ecosystem, of course, includes the natural world, but also the social and political and economic world, and also a sacred ecosystem. And so then people will say, well, that's too big. You can't study that. And we say, well, that's why it's transdisciplinary. And to not study that is to reproduce the problem of separability, which is really driving a lot of the, they say that's the meta crisis driving the poly crisis. So you've got environmental destruction, you've got economic calamity, you've got political decline, you have all of this polarization. What's behind all of that? Well, to some extent, this willingness to look at a part without looking at the whole. And flourishing is encouraging us to pay attention to the parts as they relate to the whole and as they relate to all the other parts. And that is, that's not comfortable for people who have carved it up, because they feel maybe implicitly attacked when we say things like this. Yeah. Oh, well, my research has no value. No, your research in dialogue has great value. Your research in monologue is probably the problem.
Yeah. I mean, just yesterday here on campus at Baylor, I wandered into in the back of a session, and I don't know who the professor was, but someone had raised the question about his work on flourishing and the common good, and he said something to the effect of, he said, "Yeah, it's that there's a place to talk about, for example, the goods of the violinist as an individual player, but only ultimately within the context of the orchestra.
Yeah.
And there's a place to talk about the beauty and the goods of the individual flower, but ultimately only within the context of the garden.
Yeah.
And I found that a very helpful metaphor, and I hear you saying a very similar thing, right?
I think that's really helpful. I've heard a story about a conductor doing a leadership training for business executives using an orchestra, and telling the orchestra, let's play a few minutes of this piece that we're going to play. And they just start playing, and he's never conducted them before, they don't know anything about him, but they're just playing it and it sounds good and there's polite applause. And then he says, okay, now I want you to look at each other in the orchestra and really connect with each other. And then I want you just to play the note C. And they play this beautiful note and the executives start crying. So now we've gone beyond content delivery or a kind of monologue to a relational field that is deeply rooted in dialogue and enabled to connect with the whole person, not just the ear, which is hearing interesting music, but the heart. And so I think that is really important and maybe has not been fully surfaced by a lot of the again, I'm using this distinction between analytical and holistic research. I think we're all so specialized. I was very specialized. And we need to ask the question, why, as you brought up, and also how does it relate? I mean, human beings are beings in relation fundamentally. And so we don't teach ontology much, and we don't really teach much about epistemology or cosmology either. But if we're not going to do that, and if we're going to continue to shrink the humanities and grow the so-called efficient technological disciplines, then we run the risk of a very reductionist anthropology. And so only by reconnecting, fundamentally, we are beings in relation. If we forget that, then we cause all kinds of problems. What are we in relationship with? We're in relationship with our deepest self. We're in relationship with others. We're in relationship with the natural world, and we're in relationship with the sacred. And if we don't honor that all the time, if we bracket that for some large parts of our time, if we're working in an organization that's not honoring that, then it's likely that we're contributing to this broader problem of separability, which is the meta crisis driving the poly crisis. And then we can't solve the poly crisis with the same analytical tools that created it.
Hello, friends. Lee Seacamp here. Do you ever wish you had more folks to discuss the conversations we offer on No Small Endeavor? Something like a podcast listening club where you could engage big ideas about what it means to live life well and then discuss it with friends and companions? If so, you have stumbled upon the announcement you have been waiting for. We're pleased to announce the start of Endeavor Together, our new initiative that equips and nurtures close-knit communities to talk about the things you actually want to talk about. Each small group conversation series is built upon our podcast content and provides you with super easy to use content with questions, videos, links, and guidance so that you or any good and willing soul can host small group conversations exploring what it means to live a good life. Maybe you'll meet in homes around a table, maybe in a coffee shop or local park, maybe at work during lunch hour, maybe in a church Sunday school class. What we are providing is the scaffolding for good conversation. The rest is up to you. And here's the best part. Thanks to generous support from the Lilly Endowment, it's free. The first two series have been released. The first, Let's Disagree Better, and the second, Vulnerability. Get started today. Visit NoSmallEndeavor.com and click on Endeavor Together. Again, go to NoSmallEndeavor.com and click on Endeavor Together. Enjoy. So the meta crisis being the larger crisis of separating ourselves out into divisions rather than a holistic account of what it means to be human.
Separating ourselves from our best possible self, first of all.
Because of some...
I have a job to do. My job is to club baby seals, and that's what I'm getting paid to do. So I'm clubbing these seals. That's not what I would choose to do if I were deeply in touch with myself. I might refuse that. So separation from our best possible self, separation from all others without exception. That's a high standard. But if we recognize that we either flourish together or we don't flourish at all, then we can start with that. And otherwise, we're talking about extracting a sense of happiness or positive affect through harming others. And the others or the people that we harm often include ourselves as we pursue need substitutes because we can't get this basic. There was a study that looked at not forcing people to answer a survey question on happiness and then rate how happy they are, but inviting them to describe what happiness was. And people talked about ontological rootedness, not in those terms, but they would say it's a sense of being at peace within myself and having harmonious relations with others. And if we understand that that's what comes up when you give people the freedom to answer a question, define it themselves, just as people will define flourishing very holistically. I don't actually want to extract resources to have my material needs met in ever more sophisticated ways at the expense of your ability to survive. I just don't want that.
Yeah.
And most people, maybe there's some exceptions. Yeah. I did study murder at one point, so there's a few exceptions.
So you just talked about material needs. So what all are you learning about the escalation of the material abundance that, say, Western civilizations are experiencing with regard to flourishing? It
doesn't lead to subjective individual flourishing, and it doesn't lead to this broader holistic version of flourishing.
So you mean by individual flourishing, you mean individual self-reported affect?
Yes. So in the Global Flourishing Study, we have a composite measure called the Secure Flourishing Index, and that asks people about their happiness and life satisfaction, meaning and purpose, their sense of their own character and virtue, their sense of their quality of their close social relationships, emotional and physical health, and those are the kind of ends in themselves. And then there's a sixth domain, which is financial material stability, which is understood as an enabling domain. So if you're starving to death, your physical health is not great. So, but these other things are pursued as ends in themselves, and they're nearly universally valued. But when you ask people around the world, and we've got 22 countries, geographically, culturally diverse, community, nationally representative samples, when you ask people how they're doing on this metric, it's not the high-income countries that come out at the top. It's the middle income. Now, we don't have the truly low-income countries because Gallup, the polling firm, didn't have the infrastructure in those countries to really pull together a representative sample for the money that we had. You can do anything with infinite funds. But, working within constraints, we find that it's the middle-income countries that have prioritized some of our predictor variables like religious service attendance, showing love and care, various kinds of belonging, social support, that have the higher self-reported individual flourishing scores. And the higher income countries are not at the top of that list. And so the other thing that we're noticing is that young people in the high income countries are sort of doing the worst of any age group, but not in every country, just in the high income countries. So there's something that young people are telling us about how they are rejecting the conditions that we have created for them. And so if we take that, so the takeaway there, this is just individual subjective experience of flourishing on a survey. So there's other ways to look at it. But I think as we've created spaces for dialogues across cultures where people can just express what flourishing means to them, it's not more stuff. And it's not working in an organization whose goal is greater market share and more stuff. It's the kinds of deep relationships that human beings form with each other, with their sense of their emerging, becoming self, and with the natural world and the sacred world as well. So those are the things that you could find other ways to investigate that or to inquire into that besides surveys, and that's what comes up there.
I mean, I remember Aristotle basically says you have you don't want to be poor, because then you can't pursue a flourishing life when you're trying to figure out where your next meal's coming from.
Yeah.
And at the same time, he says, but you also don't want too much, because that can be destructive to you. And then who was it Deaton and Kahneman that had this? I think it was a Nobel Prize winning. Was it Nobel? One of them was Nobel Prize winner, where they looked at predictors of happiness with regard to income.
Yeah.
And I guess it was in 2008, maybe it was like 75 grand or whatever is the kind of place at which your happiness begins to decline,
right.
actually, or you hit a peak at 75 grand or whatever.
Well, but if you have a sacred calling, you can live on a lot less.
Yeah.
You can take the vow of poverty and not be concerned about that, because you're in service to a higher calling than a middle-class lifestyle. So there is some variation there within, but I think in general, yes, like as a measure of central tendency, yes, I think that's about right.
So when you say middle-income countries, what would be examples of that?
So, we have countries like Brazil, Indonesia, India, Philippines, that are, not at the bottom of the income list, but sort of climbing, aspiring to have, to be in the higher income bracket. And the question is, how do you preserve what is contributing to your individual subjective experience of flourishing while you pursue greater and greater economic development? And, that has, so I guess the other way I would say it is that every country in our list, as we've looked into not just what we're measuring, but what other people are measuring, every country has strengths and weaknesses. So some countries score really well on Yale's Environmental Performance Index, and other countries score well on the Human Freedom Index or the Global Peace Index. But most countries, or our Secure Flourishing Index, but most countries do not score at the top of all of those things. So is there an opportunity for us to create a space of dialogue among the human species to try to figure out how do we better harmonize and integrate across these different domains that people care about? So yes, it's great to have a sense of meaning and purpose and feel like you're a good person and all the rest. But wouldn't it be nice if we were also objectively contributing to global peace?
Yeah.
And so it's possible for the subjective and the objective measures to be misaligned. And what's that telling us? And then how do we create possibilities for sharing of strengths and, let's say, vulnerabilities, so that we can begin to decide as a species, are we serious about shared flourishing, or is it going to be the war of all against all?
You've mentioned the beloved community several times. Tell us more about what has captured you about that construct.
Well, Martin Luther King Jr. said a couple of really brilliant things, and I know he was influenced by Howard Thurman and just a number of people. So this is perennial wisdom in a sense. But one thing he said is that power without love is reckless and abusive. But power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. So there's a kind of ontological unity there between power, love, and justice. There's a relationship. Love is in relation with these other things. And to look at love separately, you get what he called kind of sentimental, anemic love that is powerless. But you don't want reckless and abusive power. So the only way forward is to combine those. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. So in the beloved community, that's your aim. And another phrase that I love from King is that he says that love in action is insistence on community even when one tries to break it. So I've just been in so many groups that say, okay, that's it, we're done. This community didn't work, on to the next one. And to just insist, no, we're a community and everyone is welcome, even the ones who are trying to break it. Because maybe tomorrow I'll be the one that tries to break it. And that's where you need forgiveness and restorative processes. And so I got involved in some restorative justice work years ago and just was really inspired by people who had been victimized in some way in a criminal act, coming together with the person who victimized them to try to make things as right as possible. I can't turn back the clock, but what can I do to find a greater sense of wholeness? And I think, as the offender, you need to help me because you did something to cause this. And so you have a responsibility. And so there's a whole collection of practices around that. And so in a beloved community, you would say that, we're not really interested in exiling people. We're not interested in it's over forever. We are interested in the possibility that we can flourish together. And if we demonstrate a deep-rooted love, then perhaps that can help people who are not practicing that get curious about that. And so whether you call that beloved community or community of love or any number of labels that people have put on that over the years, it's really the hope that if you practice a genuine love and people feel that that's what's happening, there is a genuine concern for the other for their sake, even if the other is causing harm to the community, even if the other is causing harm to me individually. But there's a genuine concern that that's an incredibly powerful force. And there's a lot of religious teachings on that topic. Religion at its best is connecting people with that ultimate power.
So I'm wondering, and so we began talking about your earlier work and asking a question about crime, about murder, immigration, and your empirical research showing, oh no, what a lot of people are presuming is in fact false, and having to deal with this inability for our society to grapple with what appears to be empirical reality and instead being pushed and manipulated by fear. And so I kind of was in my mind thinking, okay, and I even said, that's a big pivot into what you've done. But in some ways, there's a parallel because it seems that what you're arguing and what your research is showing in this interdisciplinary work is that what we have presumed by and large is not in fact true.
Yes.
And that here you are yet again in this difficult place of giving your life's work to something that most people just simply don't buy. And they may buy it, in word, but we don't seem to buy it in deed.
Yeah, we're trapped in our monologues.
Yeah.
And so part of the difficulty is just inviting people to get curious about what someone else is sharing. So inviting the United States to get curious about Indonesia. Of course, we're number one, highest GDP and all of the stuff. Well, what is it that we are suffering with right now, suffering from and with, and how can we learn through dialogue with others about how they've addressed that, perhaps more successfully? So, I think there's just so many opportunities for us to open up to something that we foreclosed because it felt safe to foreclose it. But there's a great story, what we talk about when we talk about love, Raymond Carver. And there's this image, this metaphor of the knight, protected in armor. And I think one of the characters says something, well, sometimes they fall off the horse into the river and drown because the armor's so heavy or something like that. I have just often seen people become more fully alive by engaging with something surprising that they had a trained incapacity to see, like they couldn't see it. And then when somehow it's revealed, they say, oh, yes, okay, there's something there that I have ignored for most of my life because I've been trained to look at it in a different way. But now we're starting to open that up through dialogue. And, I could go on for hours about this, but I remember I was in 7th grade and I liked learning about the different subjects to some extent, but not, I wasn't fully alive in school. And I remember sitting in it was a music class, and that day we weren't playing instruments. We were sitting at our desk. There's maybe 50 people at each desk or at desks, and people were singing, and I can't sing. I have a terrible voice, and so I felt sad about that because I really appreciate good singing, and I know just how bad I am. But I just started crying uncontrollably in this class, and I didn't know why. And so people stopped singing, and they're like, "What's wrong with Matt?" Like, pat me on the shoulder. I'm like, I don't know. So, something is wrong and I can't name it. And so, years later, I would say that I was not developing as a whole person. I was not developing in a beloved community, and I was not developing in thriving ecosystems. There was sort of decline everywhere, including I was gaining kind of cognitive knowledge, but in some ways I was moving further and further away from my possibilities. And that was a long journey to rediscover possibilities and to connect with something more deeply. So I still don't, to this day, I don't know why I cried in that moment. I didn't do it again. It was enormously embarrassing, and so I just don't cry as a matter of policy. It won't happen again. And so I don't know exactly why, but I think I think I was sensing something that is the primary experience of the vast majority of the world's population, which is that we are not developing our best possible selves. We're not relating within beloved communities, and we're not contributing to thriving ecosystems across all these different types. And so we have an opportunity to explore that, but only through dialogue. It can't be hearing from experts.
So when you think about your own life trajectory and getting to where you are and asking these kinds of questions and wanting to explore both for yourself individually and in your work to make new possibilities for others to live most fully alive, what was it about childhood Matt maybe that has set you on this life course?
Don't make me cry. I don't know. I had the comparative sociologist in me was born early. We lived in Texas. I went to a Southern Baptist preschool. Then we moved to Ohio the next year. I went to a Pentecostal kindergarten, and then went into the public school the next year after that, and went to a Methodist church. So those are all very different approaches. And I remember seeing beauty in each of them and seeing some problems in each of them. And I just remember being in kindergarten, we were ushered into this large auditorium, and there was an evangelist talking about salvation and whatnot. And he was going on and on about how Jesus loved everybody, which I thought, oh, that's nice. I like that. But then the twist is, but he will say to you, depart. And I've never forgotten the word depart. Like it's tattooed on my soul, in my heart. And I just thought, as a 5-year-old, I can't make sense of this. What are you saying? So it's unconditional love, but unless I fulfill the condition, it is depart. And so I've just been, for whatever reason, I've been in a lot of different groups that frame things in a radically different way from each other. And many of them say it's our way or the highway. And I've just have experienced over the course of my life too many examples of that, and they can't all be right. And so I started to ask the question, well, what does it mean if they're all partly right and partly wrong? And again, I think there's an opportunity for dialogue for us to help understand each other and learn from each other what we're getting right and where we might have some blind spots. So I think that, I can look back and create all kinds of stories. So Whether that's the right one, I don't know. But I feel like there was something to that. Those early experiences of just being whipsawed from one radically different approach to another. And then, seeing having very different experiences of education. I remember my second grade teacher had a background in theater. And so we learned through creative expression, the core courses, whether it was math or science or whatever. We were fully engaged. I felt like a whole person in that class. And it was so different than some of my other classes where it was just rote memorization or really kind of dehumanized work, where the argument was, you will need this at some point in your life. And I'm not sure that any of that was true. You need to read at some basic level, but there are other capacities that weren't being cultivated that I probably have relied on more than some of what I was told would be so important. But you have to have a compelling reason to pay attention for 8 hours a day to things that are a little bit unclear. Why am I doing this? And is it just because they say so, or is there actually some intrinsic or even transcendent value here? So I don't know. It's a long-winded way to answer your question, but I do think that for whatever reason, I was blessed or cursed with an inquiring mind at that level.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's felt like a curse.
Well, it's interesting too that, you recounted there a very young childhood theological experience.
Yeah.
And then you've also recounted a different kind of theological posture with a phrase that you've used 3 or 4 times, that is living fully alive. And that, I've told, my undergrad students through the years, one of my favorite lines from the early church fathers is from Irenaeus, who says that the glory of God is a human being fully alive.
Yes.
And so that's a very different kind of posture, I think, of that the invitation, as we think about human flourishing, as we think about what genuine happiness entails, is it's got to look something like being fully alive.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's a different kind of theological vision than a finger wagging, if you don't do this right, then depart from me, right?
Right.
And so that's just fascinating to hear you that naturally kind of come out in what you've been describing.
That's very well put. And again, I'm so glad this is a dialogue. What comes to mind for me is Orland Bishop has a book called The Seventh Shrine. And I remember a line from this book. I've had one conversation with him, but I know he's a kind of spiritual mentor to a great many people across great many traditions. And he dropped out of medical school to care for someone who was dying of AIDS. And this person, right before he died, said to Orland, if you go back to medical school, you won't become what you were meant to be. And he didn't go back. And so when this person died, he had this sort of realization that I don't want more. And many of us have been conditioned to want more, but I don't want more. I don't want more of anything but what is fully alive in me, and to share that with others who want to live. And so I think, when I've encountered spaces, we can call them beloved community, or we can call them spaces of dialogue, where everyone is invited to contribute their best gifts, where everyone has infinite value, everyone has inherent dignity. Then you see this natural emergence of holistic flourishing that is that's quite inspiring, and you do feel fully alive. And then you say, wow, did 3 hours go by? That's incredible. I thought it was like 10 minutes. And so you start to compare that and contrast that with other kinds of hierarchically ordered systems where you're not invited at all. And somebody wants your time and your attention and your labor or whatever it is they want, but you're not actually invited as a person. You're invited as a cog in a machine. And so another phrase that has stuck with me since I read it back in 2015 in an article about an epidemic of suicide in Silicon Valley in the Atlantic. One of the representatives to the school board, I think it was Palo Alto, very well resourced. These are academic overachievers, all of the opportunities in the world at their feet. And the representative to the school board said, this is collective insanity. We feel like lifeless bodies in a system.
Wow.
I get chills every time I say that. Lifeless bodies in a system. Yes, that is a good descriptor of how 8 out of 10 people experience work and around the world. And it's no wonder that Gallup finds what they call the school cliff. When you look at the engagement levels in elementary school, it's almost 8 out of 10. And then you go to middle school, when I started crying, and it's 6 out of 10. And then by high school, it's 4 out of 10. So where does it go from there? It keeps going down. And who's the lowest? The teachers, 3 out of 10. So why is that? So they say that every system is perfectly designed to get the result that it gets. So what is our education system designed to get? Disengagement. So why would we want that? We're, in the words of Otto Scharmer, we're collectively creating results that nobody wants. And so the question is, how do we begin to so first we have to recognize that, and then how do we begin to change that? We need some different tools than the ones that we were trained to use. And so there has to be what Otto calls a sensing from the field, not just my own subjective experience, not just your and my intersubjective experience, not some outsider, a third party or third person experience, but how do we begin to sense collectively what has gone wrong and how to make it right? And so the last people that I'll name today are Harville Hendricks and Helen LaKelly Hunt, who have written for years on the importance of dialogue. And so I was sort of practicing it without realizing the depth of what was emerging until I started encountering their work. And so their latest book is How to Talk with Anyone About Anything. And I remember Harville saying, we can be in relationship for 30 years and never connect. We can have countless monologues, but we never actually had a dialogue, so we never actually connected. And recently he said to me, we spend our lives seeking external resources to try to find fulfillment, but it ultimately is unsatisfying. We have to realize that we are the resource, and then we share that through dialogue, and then we're fully alive. I mean, I'm riffing a little bit,
sure, yeah. but a lovely riff, So as we close, I can imagine someone listening and saying, "Yeah, I see this, I feel this, I experience this in my own life and vocation or lack of sense of vocation." Yeah. Give us some practical, okay, where next? What next?
Yeah. So back in 2019, I started sensing with a small group of educators. I mean, I was teaching a university course at Harvard and others were teaching at other universities. And I started sensing that we weren't flourishing as we were promoting flourishing. We were, in some ways, there's a category of burnout called engaged exhaustion. You really care about what you're doing, but you're kind of doing it in the wrong way. The weight of the world is on your shoulders, and so you can't bear that. And so we started what I called a community of practice education for flourishing. And eventually people started inviting others, and maybe they weren't educators, but how are we to get in the way of helping people flourish as they promote flourishing? So it turned into the Flourishing Network. And now we've got something like 600 members or something. So, people want this, and they can practice it with very little coaching or guidance. A little bit, like you need to be invited somehow. And so it just sort of snowballs from there. The other example I would say is my friend Bill Pearson, who was teaching anatomy to first-year medical students. And many of them were dealing with burnout and not very well. And so he created a learning community where they could, in effect, practice virtuous friendship with each other. And it didn't cost the university any money, and it didn't take a lot of his time. It took a little bit of time to set it up, but people naturally can do this. And it's only because we've been conditioned not to do it that we need just a reminder or an invitation. Interestingly, Bill and I have published a chapter recently in a book called The Future of Education. The chapter is called Love as the Essence of Flourishing. And then the subtitle of that is Educational Experiments in the Subjunctive Mood. So moving out of the indicative mood, which is this is what it is, it's really bad, to, well, this is what it might be. Let's live as if we're in a beloved community and create these communities of practice. The most interesting thing in that chapter is a footnote where Bill notes that this group of students met outside of the brand new $70 million medical education building that had just opened. They were meeting in a pretty humble environment, a building that wasn't anything like that. And they came to describe themselves as the rebels on Yavin 4. And Yavin 4, of course, is the moon base in Star Wars from which Luke Skywalker and others launched the attack on the Death Star. And they described the medical education building as the Death Star.
My. Wow.
Maybe that's a good way to end. So we can all go to Yavin 4 anytime we want. It only takes us, we had maybe 12 people in that little community of practice, and now it's expanding. We're actually having our first in-person, it's always been on Zoom, but our first in-person summit next month at Harvard. So people are coming from all over to finally get together in person. So,
and where can folks find out more information about that?
If you go to the Human Flourishing Program's website and just click on Flourishing Network. Yeah. So what can we do? Like, what's a step that we can take? And I had mentioned Bob Chapman earlier, CEO of Barry Wehmiller Incorporated, and he wrote this book, Everybody Matters. And he argues that he had to unlearn a lot of what he learned in his MBA program to be a good leader. And one of the things that was helpful to his now family of businesses, they have 156, something like that, subsidiaries around the world, is that some of his senior leaders came to him and said, Bob, we need to help our team members learn how to listen well to each other. And I'll get the story not 100% right, but he said something like, that's a terrible idea. We're not doing that. And so they left, and they came back and they said, we've outvoted you. We're doing this. And maybe you need to listen a little bit better. So they have found that training, he would love to say to people, you have to care about each other. You have to love each other. But that doesn't really have any impact. What has the impact is if you give people the skills to listen deeply to each other, and then give them the skills to practice gratitude for each other. He'll start a meeting by saying, let's go around the room and everybody share an example of how someone in this room helped them in the last week. And that changes the whole temperature of the room. So providing these really basic, seemingly basic skills is really important. And, Bob has said to me, I've gone to school districts and I've said, you have a great debate team. You might have won the state championship. So you're annihilating the other person. Great job. You're listening just enough to destroy. Great job. You have a beautiful speech class where you get up and you give monologues, but you don't have anything on listening. And he says, they laugh at me. You're like, why would we teach listening as a skill? Why would we teach expressing gratitude? Can you imagine a course on gratitude? My friend Bob Emmons would love it. He's a psychologist of gratitude. Gratitude helps you live longer. Why wouldn't we want that for our students, for our staff, for our teachers? And yet we're not organized that way. So there is an opportunity to give people the foundational skills that enable them to love each other more fully into being.
Yeah. Been talking to Matthew Lee, professor at Baylor University, also director of the Flourishing Network at Harvard University. Visiting here at Baylor University, compliments of the Institute for Faith and Learning. Delightful to be with you today. Thanks so much for your lovely work and the wonderful conversation.
Thank you for the dialogue.
Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible. Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Carrie Harmon, Jason Cheesley, Sophie Byard, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, and Audrey Griffith. Our theme song was composed by Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of Tokens Media, LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.